Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Good morning and salam alaikum. And first and foremost, a huge thank you to Dawn Media, to all of the government actors, to the Honourable Minister for Planning and Development, to all the development partners, to the UN Resident Coordinator, all of the UN leadership that's sitting here, to the private sector, to civil society, to academia. Thank you. Thank you for stepping up to talk about climate change at a time when almost everybody else is stepping back. It takes a huge amount of courage not to wish away the weather, because we're seeing it happen in a lot of countries, with a lot of companies, at the expense of an awful lot of communities. And it's this magical thinking that I wanted to talk about this morning. And in particular, 5 myths that I think it's important that together we bust, because these are myths that are holding us back from actually making a difference. The first myth is that climate change is an environmental problem. It's not. The planet's going to be just fine. It's true, as the Honourable Resident Coordinator said, that we are on a highway, or as Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Absolutely true. We are on the road to reaching over 3 degrees Celsius change. This past year, we just passed 1.5 degree change, and look at what happened. Fires, droughts, floods. But even still, the planet's going to be fine. This isn't an environmental problem. So then this is the second myth that we have to bust. If it's not an environmental problem, what is it? We all know the answer. It's an economic problem. But this is the thing that we don't like to say enough. It's not a particularly big economic problem. We co-wrote with many government agencies and partners a country climate and development report 2 years ago. And looking at the models, it showed that Pakistan is at risk of losing anywhere from 6.5% to 9% of its GDP annually starting in 2050 because of climate change. That sounds like a lot. But the truth is, today, Pakistan loses over 6% of its GDP because of inefficient urban transportation. So that's a cost you're willing to put up with already. You lose more than that as a cost every year because of air pollution. And you're willing to put up with that. So at the aggregate level, the economic costs are not huge. So then the third myth that we have to bust is that it's everybody's problem. Because if it's not an environmental problem, if it's not an economic problem on the aggregate, what is it? It's a problem of the poor. And that's why we as the World Bank stand here today, because our job is to help you end poverty. And no country in the region has been better at ending poverty in the last 20 years than Pakistan. You've lifted 48 million people out of the indignity of poverty. But climate change is going to make that stop. As Pakistan has ambition to become an upper middle income country by 2047, it cannot happen with climate change, because you're still going to have 30% of the country, more so than today, who are going to be living in poverty, because climate change is a poverty trap. It's a poverty tar pit. It's impossible to get out of poverty when you scrape together, through your own blood, sweat, and tears, some small assets, only to see them washed away in a flood. Only to see you having to sell those few assets you have in a drought to put food on the table. I can't imagine anything much worse than for those 48 million people who in the last 20 years got out of poverty, who finally didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, who finally had safe shelter, to fall back into poverty, to fall back into a place where they have to watch their children go hungry. And that's what climate change threatens. It threatens the people who've climbed out of poverty. It threatens to take away a path out of poverty for people who are still in poverty. This isn't an environmental problem. This isn't an aggregate economic problem. This is a problem for the poor. The next myth that we have to bust is that climate change is all about energy. And in many ways it is. If we're going to bend that curve of carbon emissions, we have to do it through the power sector, through energy. It's half of your emissions here in Pakistan, even though those emissions are less than 1% of global emissions. But the truth is, and what we don't like to talk about, is that that's going to happen anyway. The energy revolution has started. There's over $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, being invested every year in renewable energy technologies. We don't need a COP agreement. We don't need a Paris agreement to manage this energy revolution. It has reached escape velocity. It's happening anyway. Look at solarization here in Pakistan. So energy isn't the sector that we need to keep focusing on with quite so much energy, if you'll forgive the pun. It's agriculture, and it's water. Because agriculture threatens to lose 17% of its market share globally, 17% of its food production domestically because of climate change. Think about what that means for food security. Think about what that means for foreign exchange earnings. In a country with the 5th largest beef herd in the world, that produces 6% of global milk production, climate change has added to the reality that half of Pakistani rangelands are degraded, directly threatening that beef herd and the foreign exchange that comes with it, and the food security that comes with it, and the cultural security that comes with it. This is about agriculture. This is about water. These are the sectors where we need to really put our energy. And finally, and this is the hardest myth to bust, but it is the most important one, climate finance. It is absolutely true that Pakistan is not the reason that fires are burning up Los Angeles. Pakistan is not the reason that 1/3 of the country 2 years ago was underwater and 3 million people fell back into poverty because of the floods. Pakistan is not the reason for drought and desertification in the Sahel. So it is absolutely right that the countries who have benefited from emitting should pay for the impact of those emissions on other countries. But good luck waiting. This is the problem. There are moral arguments and there are practical ways forward. And there will be too many people die if we wait for the global north to put on the table all of the money that morally they probably should. The conversations that happen under the Paris Agreement around the new collective quantified goal, we're great at coming up with acronyms on climate change, the NCQG, to move from $100 billion a year to $300 billion a year. That sounds like a lot of money. It's not. Most of it is in lending. It's not in grants. Most of it is already there. It's not additional. Part of this $300 billion a year commitment are the multilateral development banks committing to provide $120 billion of that. That means that the World Bank, for example, we're committed here in Pakistan in the next 10 years to using our finance to support you to create food security for an additional 30 million people, to make 75 million people resilient against the impacts of climate change. But that's money we were going to invest in Pakistan anyway. And we all know how difficult it is to access the very, very small grant financing that exists in the GEF or the Green Climate Fund or the new Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which today has available $80 million. That's million with an M. So we cannot wait for Global North to send the money south. nor can we expect carbon markets to fill the gap. Carbon markets are very much at an inflection point. There's good news. The Article 6 rulebook was agreed to in the COP29 in Azerbaijan. So there will be a new UN-managed carbon market, but the voluntary carbon market is declining enormously by more than half in the last 2 years, from what was just $2 billion a year to now $700 million a year. That's, again, not a lot of money. So when it comes to international public finance, when it comes to the carbon markets, these revenue streams will ever only be the cherry on top. The money to bake the cake. The money to take advantage of the energy revolution, the money to help adapt, to help build resilience, to help use adaptation investments to modernize agriculture, to transform the water landscape, are going to have to come out of your pockets. It's going to have to come from government. It's going to have to come from subsidy reform, from new taxes, from changing expenditure, and it's going to have to come from domestic private sector, from local money markets, from local capital markets. That's where the money to bake the cake will come in international public finance carbon markets. That'll pay for the cherry on top, and cherries are great on cakes. That's all it's going to pay for. So we need to come together, and I echo what his Honourable Minister said in terms of thinking about climate change as an opportunity, not an obligation. And in terms of that, Madam Chairwoman, I wanted to propose that we change the name of this conference from Breathe Pakistan to Lead Pakistan. Because the world needs leadership, and you are stepping up, as I said, when everybody else is stepping back. And so I thank you and know that the World Bank stands with you. Thank you very much.